You guys for tuning in to James Hill TV, where we talk money, marketing, and motivation. I'm your host, James Hill. Today, we have a very, very special guest, Melissa Proctor. Melissa Proctor is an artist, a branding expert, and who started her career as a ball girl and risen up to become the executive vice president and chief marketing officer for the Atlanta Hawks and the State Farm Arena down in Atlanta, Georgia. And now author of From Ball Girl to CMO. So we're going to dig into this incredible book, and I encourage everyone listening to this and watching this to go get a copy of the book. And we're going to talk about how you guys can get a copy of the book later on. But first, I want to say, Melissa, thank you for coming on. I know I'm going to enjoy this, and my listeners and viewers is going to enjoy this as well.
No, man, thank you for having me. I mean, I appreciate all the work that you've been doing and, following you on Instagram. And so it's my pleasure to be here.
All right. So I read the book, and I actually read it twice because I wanted to make sure
Okay. All
for the people listening and reading. It's a very quick read, straight to the point. A ton of gems. You can take a lot of notes, and I was able to read it twice. And I wanted to read it twice because I wanted to make sure I get some of the good points that you have in here. One of the things you talked about a lot, and it was a recurring theme in the book, is pivoting. Now
right.
you work for the Atlanta Hawks, which is in the NBA. Sports people know about pivoting, but pivoting is really, really important in business and entrepreneurship. And it's something that is very crucial to my story, and we can get into that, but this is about you. So could you talk about the art of pivoting, and what's the differences between pivoting and giving up? Because I feel like a lot of times it's the gray
Mm.
area when you're like, okay, just keep going, be consistent, do what you got to do, stay the course. And then there's times where you have to pivot and switch your strategy, but not necessarily switch the end goal. So could you tell us about your thought process on that?
I think that's a great question. And I think from my perspective, I have a very unique approach when it comes to career and direction. And so actually the tagline for the book that ended up taking off before it was published was how to pivot when you don't know what you want to be when you grow up. And I tell people to this day, even though I'm a CMO of an NBA team, I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. I've never known, I've had ideas in different ways, but that desire to continue to learn and grow is important because for me, when you stop growing and learning, you're dead.
Mm-hmm.
So, the idea of pivoting in my mind is because I don't have a definitive, it has to be this. It's having the openness and the opportunity to say, all right, I'm doing this right now. Here's an opportunity that's coming my way. Instead of not doing it out of fear or thinking like, oh, I'm not good enough or whatever, the idea that, you're just doing that to learn. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the mindset of people understanding that in these days, especially, no job is forever. And I'm a bit older, but you come from the mentality of, my parents worked the same job for 20, 30 years. And
Yes.
the idea of when you decide you're going to do something, there's no way that you can change it. To me, the idea of the pivot is knowing that the world is your oyster. You can make a change at any moment and it's okay. But giving yourself the mental freedom to know that it's okay because
Mhm.
you're only held back by either societal pressures. And obviously, there are things, paying your bills and taking care of your family. That's huge. But in the instance of feeling like you're stuck in a role, a lot of that idea of being stuck comes from within. And
Mhm.
so, really knowing and understanding if it's getting education on something else that's out there, informational meetings, or meeting new people in different worlds, and just exposing yourself to different things can help with the mechanics of how you pivot. But
Mhm.
really understanding that there's always an opportunity to me is half the battle.
Mhm. So pivoting is basically adjusting your strategy when when you find out information that you probably didn't have, that this isn't going to work, or that what you thought was true is not necessarily true. So now you have new information. You have to change the course to get to the end goal, which is whatever the end
Potentially.
goal is.
Potentially, but in my mind, pivoting is also getting yourself open because you may be in a role that's a good one. You may be in a place that's a great place and you may learn about something else and you're like, oh, I'm interested in that.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean that you're closed from being able to make that move to go learn about something else. But I think sometimes people are very rigid and it has to be this and
Okay.
nothing else. So it's not always that things are falling on the wayside or things are going badly and you have to make a change. Obviously, many times that's the case as well. But
Mhm.
sometimes even when things are good, you still have the opportunity to pivot because it's
Mhm.
still continued growth.
Yeah, and I read a lot of the changes and pivots that happened to you, the things you did in the book, and I don't want to give too much of the book away, but could you talk about the biggest pivot that you made that you feel in your career was a pivotal point to where you are today? Because when you talk about from ball girl to CMO, there's a real in between there, and there's some real strategy and education and networking and things that you had to do and that you talk about. So could you talk about one in particular that stand out to you?
I to your point, there's been a number in my career, even deciding to be a ball girl for the Miami Heat when I was 15 in high school. I was trying to get a job anywhere. My mom said you can only get a job in whatever you want to do for the rest of your life. And at the time, I thought I wanted to coach basketball in the NBA, be the first female coach in the league, but I never played basketball. So in retrospect, I'm like, how are you really going to do that? But the audacity to have that dream and that goal and to act on it is what got my foot in the door at the very beginning as the first ball girl for the Miami Heat.
Hmm.
I'd say throughout my career, there were a number of pivots, but maybe one that I think stands out, especially now. When I was very junior after graduating from Wake Forest, started my career at Turner Broadcasting here in Atlanta and working in marketing for TNT. And in the marketing department, I came in as an intern. It was an 11-month paid internship. It was really baptism by fire. So you come in, you prove yourself, and you learn on the fly. And so there wasn't always a guaranteed job at the end of the 11 months, but you really, if you came in and proved yourself, potentially there would be. The person who was there before me did not get a job.
Hmm.
And so when I came in, my goal was to, be the best I could. I had great advice from one of my mentors, Scott Saffron. He was like, find something to be famous for. Like, what's going to make you stand out while you're here? And so took his advice, came in, kicked butt, took names, and maybe around 6 or 7 months into my internship, they offered me a full-time job to stay on with the marketing department for TNT, which you would say is success.
Right.
And at the time, I looked around and I was like, here is the moment in my life. Like, everyone that I'm working with is probably a little bit older. They're getting married. They have maybe some have kids.
Hmm.
And I was 22, huge afro, loving life in Atlanta. And I was like, man, they seem so settled. I'm not really ready to settle, but it was a great job opportunity. And so it was, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to take this job or look for another job or do something else? And I decided that I wanted to live abroad for a year because I really wanted to travel and get some of that out my system. And so I found out about a master's program in London, where it was a 1-year master's where I can focus on brand strategy, had learned about it. And so I decided if I can raise the funds to go to grad school in London, then I'm going to decline this job offer of real money. I was an intern. I was hustling. I was mopping up sweat for the Hawks at night because I didn't make a lot of money as an intern. But the idea of turning down a job was such a big thing to me at that time coming out of college because that's what you work for. And I think in my mind, that pivot of saying like, all right, well, I really want to go overseas was probably one of the best things that I did because it set me up on a different trajectory. One, it gave me international experience. I got to be an intern in Turner's UK office, which wasn't even in the cards. I just met someone and it worked through networking that happened. But I focused on brand strategy and I was able to come back and go down a completely different path than I probably would have gone if I just would have stayed and took the job because it was offered to me at the time. So, like I
Mhm.
said, it doesn't always have to be a negative because that one was a positive pivot,
Yes.
but you never know. You know what I'm saying? Like it could have taken me down a whole other direction.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's really challenging to do and to make a decision on because it's not like it was just a random job. I can see if
No.
you was a marketing, like you went to school for communication and branding and strategy is your thing. That's what you're an expert at. If you got offered a position doing something you didn't want to do anyway, even if it was a high salary, it's easy to kind of turn that down. But when you're interning there, the whole goal of interning is to get
Exactly.
experience to hopefully get offered a position, either that position or somewhere similar. And now you finally get that offer and you're like, yeah, I want to step it up a notch, right? So that's
Yeah.
pretty hard.
But it's also more of like life experience, like what's important to you overall. And sometimes we're so short-sighted in just what we see in front of us and not looking for the long run.
Hmm.
And I remember even having conversations with my mom and other people, and they're like, "Are you crazy?" And one was I wanted to raise this money, and so thankfully I was able to do that. And I write about that in the book of how I was able to raise $30,000 to go to London for a year to not get into debt, which was important. So that gave me some comfort. And then I had no idea what I was going to do after grad school. I was like, well, maybe they'll give me a job. I don't really know. I built good relationships. And I was able to come back to Turner in a very different way. But it was an experience for me that I think really kind of showed you got to be true to who you are,
Mhm.
regardless of what society may believe, because I truly believe whatever's for you is for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another theme in your book, and one of your principles, and we're going to get into, breaking down some of your principles, but one of them is just being authentic and being able to bring your whole self to any environment and situation that you're giving your energy to. So could you talk about that? Because I feel like that's a confidence thing, knowing yourself, for one, knowing what you bring to the table, knowing who you are. That's a confidence thing. And a lot of times people, they just want to go with the flow. Whatever this environment is doing, they're going to do it. And I wanted to ask you about that, but I wanted to tie it into like your roots. So you are Caribbean, and specifically Belizean, and that really impacted me because my girlfriend is Belizean. So when you were talking about bun and all of that, I remember going over for Thanksgiving. The first time I went over there for Thanksgiving, we eating bun and we still eat it now. So I was like really connected, and I called her on FaceTime, like, oh my gosh, she's Belizean. So this is really like, so do you think that played a role in you being your authentic self, just being quote unquote different, how you called it in the book?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm Belizean and Jamaican because my dad is from Jamaica, my mother was from Belize, but I was born in Miami. And
Mhm,
so I'll say growing up, it was a challenge because I was raised differently. People would look at me and they see an African American woman. I was like, "You're black," and I absolutely am.
mhm,
But when they talk about what you do for the holidays and where you go, and I was like, we eat ackee and saltfish and bun and these experiences for carnival. It was a different cultural experience.
mhm.
So when I got into like middle school, I was bullied for speaking too properly. My mother went to nursing school in England. And so like there was so many things. My parents had tea time. Like that was a part of my cultural norm, which, you look at people, it's obviously looking at black people as monolithic. Like we're not all one and the same, but
Right.
obviously having shared experiences and living in the US and what that means. And so I think for me growing up, especially in Miami, which was so culturally diverse,
Yes.
I didn't know black and white. I didn't see things in that way until I went to college in North Carolina. It was eye opening
Mhm.
because I had people in my dorm that wanted to touch my hair who'd never really been around black people before. And that was so different for me, but honestly, great preparation for corporate America and a lot of the work life that I've had to live.
Mhm.
And so when I initially got into Turner as an intern, I remember having a meeting, and I talk about it in the book with the president of the network at the time, who met with every intern and tried to ask how it was going. And I remember saying, I love the work. I was learning a ton. I love the people that I worked with. They were great, but I didn't feel like I fit in. And
Mhm.
so they would all go to lunches and happy hours. And, I got the introduction lunch, but after that, it was kind of like, all right, you know,
Yeah.
we didn't relate necessarily on that level. And there was no one else in the department who looked like me outside of a handful of folks who are either at an admin level or, it was just very different. And so I remember saying, I didn't feel like I fit in. And, he stopped me and said, you are here based on all that you bring. So you are doing us a disservice by feeling like you need to assimilate into this culture because all that you are is exactly what we need in this environment. We need your West Indian heritage. We need your perspective. We need all of the experiences that you've had because that's what's going to differentiate us as a business. And that diversity of thought is important. And
Mhm.
so, by bringing my entire self to work every day and talking about carnival and talking about all of these things, that was the benefit. And I'm so glad I got that lesson at that stage in my career because it has served me to this day. Now I'm not trying to assimilate to anybody. I am me 100%. And I have comfort in that because if I am in an environment that embraces that, then I can be great for that environment. And
Mhm.
so sometimes you may not be the right cultural fit because you may be in a place that may not respect those things or may not want those things. And so for me, as a part of even judging where I'm going, it's important that I can be me and have locks and a nose ring and rock my Jordans and my sweats because that's what I do traditionally. Obviously, if I have a meeting, I can dress it up.
Right, right, right.
Um, but it's still ensuring that I can do that. And if I'm leading a team, I can ensure that the people on my team can do that. Because I really believe if you can, take care of your family first and be your best self and bring your whole self to work, you'll do your best work. And
Mhm.
at the end of the day, that's best for business.
Yeah, yeah, and you mentioned something. So being your authentic self and coming to work, bringing your full self to work is one thing, but leading a team and leading an organization like you do as an executive, that's another level. So could you talk about as a leader, because we got a lot of people who listen to this and watch this. So, we have some people who are leaders of organizations who may be thinking, "Hey, I'm bringing myself to work," but it's hard to galvanize the troops, sort of say to get everybody on the same page to be able to bring themselves to have a diverse thought to bring to the organization. So what would you say to leaders who are watching this?
Yeah, well, one, I'd say you lead by example. If you are building a culture where you don't want people to stay and work till late at night, you staying and working till late at night, even though you don't think about it, your team is seeing that and they're like, oh man, she's here
Mhm.
late. I probably need to stay late too, even if it's an unspoken cultural norm. And
Yes.
so I believe that I have to do it because if I don't do it, team, you can take time off. It's okay. You need to live. Like that's important. But I think in the context of for people, I've had some colleagues that I loved working with personally. I would know them personally outside of work, and I would go to work with them, and they would be like robots. And they were trained in that way of you don't need to know anything about me personally. You don't need to understand my life. And
Mhm.
they keep work and personal very separate. There's
Mhm.
nothing wrong with that. That's just another way to approach it.
Mhm.
What I have found in my experiences is a lot of times when that's the case, depending on there's so many nuances, but a lot of times people don't necessarily trust you because they don't feel like they know you. You know what I mean? It's like, well, what do you do on the weekends? Oh, I do work. Like, okay, well, really, you don't do anything else? Like, what is of interest? Because I
Yeah.
think those connection points are what really make us relate as people.
Mhm.
The example I give often is I remember when I got promoted to chief marketing officer, I'd gone to a meeting at the arena and there's reserved spaces at the arena for executives. And so I parked in one of those reserved spaces, and security came over and said, I'm sorry, ma'am, you can't park here. This space is reserved for executives. And where some people would be so upset about that, I got hype. I was like, nah, that's great. Guess what? Hey, look, check it out. I am an
Hey,
executive. Ain't that something? And, the response was like, okay, okay. But I knew all that was breaking down stereotypes and perceptions of what people expect a chief marketing officer or an executive of an NBA team to look like. And
yeah.
so for me, the ability to bring my entire self to work and do my work and have my work and reputation speak for itself,
Mhm.
then when you see me and people get to know me, they're like, oh, but you're so cool. I'm like, why can't an executive be cool? Like, why can't you, show your passion and your culture and those sorts of things? And, traditionally people don't do that, but everyone has what works for them. So I would say understanding your culture is incredibly important because
Now,
what works for me at the Hawks may not work for me somewhere else.
now you said something in the book that really sparked a
I
conversation
can't
between.
I can't hear you. I think your audio cut out.
Can you hear me now? Hold on. I can hear you. Can you
Okay. Nope. I can hear you now.
hear
I
me
can
now?
hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said something in the book that sparked a conversation between me and my team members when you talked about the way you look at traditionally setting goals and setting linear goals. Because it was just 2 or 3 weeks ago when it was the first of the year, everybody set New Year's goals and resolutions. I'm setting revenue goals for my company. And you said you don't really set traditional goals how they are taught in business school or taught in any personal development course. You have principles you live by. Now, could you expand on that a little bit? Because we are always told you have to have goals in your career. You have to have something to aim for. Or you're not going to hit anything. And the way you broke it down and explained it was very impactful to me, and it made me rethink the way I look at things because I'm always talking about having a certain net worth at this age and having accomplished this, but I'm not saying I'm setting myself up for failure or disappointment, but those are things I strive for. And if I don't hit them, I don't look at myself as a failure. That's just me personally. But I think a lot of people do. So when they're 30 and they're not a millionaire,
Mm,
like they said when they was 15, now they look at themselves as a failure. I personally don't do that, but I know a lot of people who do. So could you expand on that?
ditto. Well, I will say that it is important to have business goals. So
Mhm.
definitely having revenue targets and metrics and KPIs, I would never say that is not important, because based on whatever business you are, having revenue and basing those goals and having your team work together to achieve them, that's important.
Mhm.
When I was talking about my guiding principles, that was much more as it related to my life and personally. So before I'll get into them, I'll give an example of why I think it matters. When I took the role as chief marketing officer, I had a number of people reaching out to me. I want to be a CMO of an NBA team too. What do I need to do? And I remember when I got promoted to CMO, my boss and I had a conversation, and I was kind of like, well, why me, bro? Like it wasn't expected at all. And he said, you know why? It's because you don't want it. And I thought that was really interesting. And I said, well, what? And the conversation was much more the understanding of, for many people, they're driven by ego, the perception of power, money,
Mhm.
whatever they think a title will bring them. When in reality, my mantra is I just want to make dope shit. Like that's what I strive to do. That's what I enjoy. And because I have a passion for people and working with teams and, really kind of pushing boundaries and trying to do different things, he's like, that's why you need to be in this role.
Mhm.
And so when people came to me and said, hey, I want to be a CMO too, and I'd always ask why. And it was like, well, I want to help control the strategy of the team. I said, you can do that as a, what is it about CMO? And so much of it went back to what my boss had said. It's the perception of the power or the title or the ego. And so, in my mind, all that is stripped away. I know that if tomorrow, and I think a lot of it has to do with my upbringing, I would spend the summers in Jamaica and Belize growing up and just seeing a completely different lifestyle, washing clothes and hanging them on the line. And, just the joy of being able to walk and go to the beach with family. So for me, like the rat race of, US culture and the way that we are just trying to rise to the top of some ladder, I'm like, and then what
Yeah.
happens? Like, and then what? So instead of focusing my efforts on a title or a job, when I was in grad school in London, I wanted a job in branding. That was kind of my goal. And that was probably the only goal that I kind of set for myself. And maybe 3 years afterwards, I ended up getting a branding job. Then I
Right.
was like, now what? Like now that you did it, it's like, do I want a senior title and branding job? And it didn't make a difference. And so I had talked to some of my mentors about the idea of defining guiding principles. What are the values that you create for yourself that will help you decide what direction to go in your life from a broader perspective, and using your experiences, the things you love, the things you hate, feedback people give you, the things that get you excited or passionate, and like putting those together to really figure out what you need in order to thrive personally. And
Mhm.
once I really started thinking about it and defining them for me, and I have kind of my starting five that I call it, it just completely transformed the way I look at jobs. So people to this day are like, oh my gosh, you're CMO of the Hawks. What are you going to do next? I'm like, I have no idea. But I have these guiding principles, and any opportunity that comes my way, I'll vet them against these things. And if they line up with it, then I'm open to just exploring the idea. And
Mhm.
that's a radical change because people expect that you're going up a ladder, that
Yeah.
I've never had a ladder. And so you talk about a ladder and a lattice career. Some people believe that you start here and you work your way up.
Yeah.
I have taken jobs that were left field, weren't creative before I got there, stuff ain't nobody ever heard of, raising my hand to take on stuff no one else ever wanted, and
Mhm.
then a desire to just learn and grow. And I think ultimately that is exactly what got me where I am, but just in a non-traditional approach.
Mhm.
And so for me, my guiding principles were one, and I learned these through jobs that I've had and experiences, being creative and strategic. As you mentioned, I'm an artist by trade. That's some of my artwork on the wall behind me. I'd love to paint. I went to college on an art scholarship. I was in magnet school and middle school and high school for art. And I love creative, but through my corporate career, I learned a lot about strategy and business strategy. I
Mhm.
learned that I do best when I'm able to put those two things together because that's my superpower, being both creative and strategic.
Mhm.
Secondly, I get bored real quick. So I need to be able to add new tools to my personal toolbox. So any job that I take on, it has to offer me something new, learn about a new industry, stretch me in a different way, because that's important to me. Because like I said, if I'm not growing and learning, like I'm dead.
Right.
The third is my mom was horrible with money when I was growing up. And so the idea of being able to be in a position where I can pay my bills on time, maybe ahead, and be able to invest in my future for myself and my daughter, that's very important to me.
Mhm.
And so then the idea of being able to help educate people and being better around how they can be better financially is important.
Mhm.
The fourth is some sort of work-life balance and harmony, and I mentioned the idea. I love to travel. I love spending time with my family and friends. And so if I am not a workaholic, I won't be the one that's going to be there 24/7. Now, if we have a big project and that's what it calls for, we're
Right.
absolutely doing it. But understanding balance, we work in order to live a life. And
Mhm.
so I think the combination, it depends. In entrepreneurship, you eat, sleep, live, breathe.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
working. It's a very different way. You know what I'm saying? But that also may be what drives you based on the passion that you have for that idea. So it's different for everyone.
Hmm.
But for me, the important piece was being able to be there for my daughter and my family.
Hmm.
That's important. And then the last piece is that authenticity. If I can't bring my whole self every day, and if you're telling me I can take this job, but I have to cut my locks, that's not where I need to be, nor where I would be. And so those are my starting five, and they seem simple, but getting there took a lot of time because I had to have experiences that were in the opposite to make me be like, no, that's real important. Like I can't thrive without that.
Hmm. Yeah. Now you mentioned being able to bring your authentic self to work. You had an experience early on when you didn't feel like you was a part of the team, even though you were on a team. Now, do you have any other experiences from the other four principles that taught you and that brought those principles up
Yeah,
to your top
absolutely.
starting five?
Yeah, every single one of them. I mean, that's how they got created. And so, and the, the being creative and strategic, after I finished graduate school, I took a job as a creative because that's the job that was available. I had a design background, so I was a motion graphics producer for a while, producing on-air graphics for TBS and TNT. It was great. It was a creative job, designing logos and making stuff move. And I realized that just because I had the skill set, I got to learn about new technology within it. But I was so bored because I couldn't make strategic decisions. If you watch any network and they have the little things in the corner that tell you to watch something tonight at 6 or 7,
Yeah,
like I was
yeah, yeah.
typing that out. I said, this is not for me because I'm not using the other side of my brain and I couldn't just be all creative. And
Mhm,
so that was like, I need to find a way to blend this marketing strategy and this creative together to do something. So
mhm,
that's where that one came from. I had other jobs where I took on a role or continued to do something for a long time where I felt like I wasn't getting anything new. And
right.
so when I had opportunities to take on task force roles and positions externally with nonprofits, and that's what got me excited. So I knew that I had to be learning. And
Mhm,
everything didn't necessarily have to be in the job, but I really had to find ways that I could continue to grow. And if I had an opportunity where I could do that in a position,
mhm,
today in my current job, there is no 2 days that are the same. I'm learning about different teams. I'm learning about different things all the time. And I
right.
thrive off of that.
Mhm,
I gave the example of my mom with the bills. So I just knew that I didn't want to come home with my lights off. Like that was not the life that I wanted to live for myself.
mhm,
And as I've gotten experience in talking with mentors and other people, they talk about having stake in a company or an organization or the idea of investments and stocks. I wasn't learning anything about that, when I was growing up. My
right.
mom was a nurse, my dad worked at a bank and sorted checks. And so for me, just that knowledge is like, okay, now that I have that, how do you continue to build and grow
Mhm,
on that? Gave the example of, the authenticity piece. But when I graduated college, my mother went out on disability the same day she dropped me off at college. And I became a caregiver. I'm an only child. And so my parents were divorced for my mother much of my working adult career. So in my 20s, she had a stroke and I had to go to Miami for about a month and help her rehab and move her into assisted living. And all of that I had to do while also working my job. And
mhm,
because I had a role that afforded me the flexibility to work remotely while I was there and really give me the time to be there for my mother, like that became the top priority in my life because I know there are many jobs that won't allow that.
mhm.
But they know when I was there, I'd give 1,000,000% of myself. And so understanding that wherever I work for, that's important was critical.
Yeah. Now you mentioned mentor, and you have a unique story in your book, and I don't want to give that one away because that one was really impactful about mentorship and how you approach that and how others look and should look at that. Um, what keeps you up at night? I'm asking you this question. What keeps you up at night in your career, whether it be being creative or as a brand strategist, or being creative with the new social media age, or like what's some things that you and your team are working on that you haven't yet grasped that you feel like you need to tackle?
I think it changes by the day, to be honest, because I think, well, within this pandemic, things are changing so rapidly,
Yeah.
especially within the NBA and what we can do, what we can't do. And we used to always have basketball camps and clinics in the community. That was a big part of our work and our outreach.
Yeah.
Now we're ensuring our team member safety and our fan safety before anything else. Like that's important. And so, how do we kind of marry these two things together with the kind of crawl, walk, run strategy of like, we don't know when things will be safe again. And so, that kind of multiple planning simultaneously is a huge challenge,
Hmm.
but something that we have to do. I'd say, this season, and one of the things that I'm most proud of almost in my career was this MLK uniform that we did for our Nike City edition for the Hawks this season.
Hmm.
When I started my role as CMO, I mean, about 3 years ago, we sat down with the Nike team, and that was the first idea that I suggested that and we designed with them. So to kind of see that come to fruition three
Wow.
years later is amazing. And having it blessed by the Pope recently, which took it to a whole other level, I'm wondering how do we top that? We have more things coming and other things coming down the pipe, but there's a lot of pressure to maintain edge and to continue to differentiate and to be
Hmm.
relevant to our audience and as true to Atlanta as we can possibly be. That's
Hmm.
important. How can we impact the community? Being the first team in the NBA to open up our building for voting, especially in Atlanta, in Georgia, of all
Yeah.
places, was a
That was
very
that
big
was
deal.
that was really a big deal. Yes.
Yeah, that was biggest community initiatives we've ever undertaken as an organization. So obviously there's not always going to be a huge general election, but what is the next thing that we can do that will really have impact? So a lot of it is just continuously trying to figure out how we can advance the ball forward and do what's best for our organization, but also for our community.
Hmm. And you have some unique experiences, and you said you wanted to be an NBA coach, and then you actually haven't accomplished you haven't accomplished that, but you have done something even better, being an executive, running an entire organization. Um, what as a leader, when you have to turn down somebody as talented as yourself because you got turned down from different positions that you thought you wanted to do, what goes into your mind? Like, how do you even communicate that to a young Melissa who's you see they're very, let's say you see they're very creative, and like the NBA said, you're not like this position, you're too creative for this position. Like that's
Yeah.
it seems like a compliment, but it could be, it could demotivate a lot of people who don't have their mind on or their confidence up, saying you're too creative. That might make them not wanting to actually create or be creative and actually, try to fit into a corporate environment where they don't actually fit into. So how do you even communicate that to a young Melissa or somebody's coming up that a position may not be best for them, but their talents may be best, elsewhere?
Well, to your point, I got told no a lot of times and still get told no a lot of times in different ways and contexts these days. But I will say that what I've learned over the years is context and understanding the why make all the difference. So I wish when the NBA turned me down for that internship and told me I was too creative in their business, that's all I got. I
Right.
didn't understand that, the NBA was made up of a lot of attorneys and a lot of their work was on like IP rights and licensing. I
Mm.
know that now being on the team side, but now I can be like, I totally understand why. So
Right.
as a leader, if I am communicating to someone, a young Melissa, you know, it's important to me. And I think my team now also realizes that people may be like, oh no, we can't do that. And I'm like, why can't we do that? Take
Right.
the time, the extra beat to explain, because I think to your point, it makes all the difference in the perception of the person and opens them up to like, oh, you don't hate me. It's because of these things. Or,
Yeah.
you never understand the perspective of the organization. Folks are like, hey, well, how do I get a job on your team? What are you looking for? I
Yeah.
said, it depends on the position. Every position isn't the same. So if I'm looking for a copywriter with an irreverent voice to help do something cool and different on Instagram, if someone is a corporate writer working for a very corporate company who may be a fantastic writer, I may not go that route, but there may be somebody who's off the beaten path doing something crazy irreverent over there with a
Hmm.
lot less experience, but may have more of the spirit of what I'm looking for my position.
Hmm.
So you have to understand the context that you're being put within, because it's not always just about the person directly. It's really the role you're trying to fit. And a lot of times, which is overlooked and something most people don't communicate, it may be the gaps on the team. So
Right.
there may be already people in the organization, and I might have 5 people great at this and one person who's also great at the same thing. I'm like, I might need somebody who's different and better in a different thing to
Yes.
help round out the team to make us stronger.
Hmm.
And those sorts of nuances are really hard, but important when you're promoting or talking to or helping to manage any talent coming into a company.
And I made a post on social media, and a lot of people, I don't know why they didn't believe me, but I had like 20, probably like 24, 20, 25 different jobs, and I'm only 26, and they were like, "How did you have this many jobs?" And I was just telling them I used to apply for a lot of jobs, and the reason I started my company and my media and marketing firm is because the jobs that I was applying for, none of them, like I was applying at marketing firms and different type of marketing and branding, because that's what I wanted to do. I went to school for communication and marketing, so that's what I wanted to
Mhm.
do. But I didn't get any of the jobs. Like people, it's so crazy how people are just really hitting me back in my email like, hey, we want to come in for an interview. I'm like, that was 2 years ago, right? And it's
Uh-huh.
ridiculous. But I look at it now and say I would have never started my own company. I would have
Absolutely.
never had my own studio. I would have never had my own show, my own podcast. I would have never, been able to speak and travel and do the things that I do now in my business. I would have never been able to do that if I would have got one of those jobs. And I know it's people who got those jobs that probably didn't have the aspiration that I have to travel and do all these other things entrepreneurial, and they that job was best fit for them. So I think it's just hard to
Mhm.
internalize when somebody tell you no, that maybe they were actually right and you were wrong. So that's really hard, and I'm learning every day on
Let me tell you, I truly believe that what's for you is for you, and everything happens for a reason. I give the example of I was at Turner for 11 years and had 9 jobs. People are like, how are you in the company 9 years? And started as a trainee and an intern and worked my way up to vice president of marketing and content creative,
that.
which was almost unheard of in that company at that time because there were so many people who'd been there for 18, 20 years who were trying to work their way up. But because I took all these different jobs that weren't connected was one of the reasons. And the last role that I had was a digital health and wellness startup. And when the position became open, I was a part of a task force that developed into a business unit. And they
Mhm,
said, hey, Melissa, you've done a great job in this task force, would love to offer you this opportunity. I
mhm,
had mentors that said, don't do it. Turner's not great at launching these new businesses.
mhm.
Don't take that risk. You're in a great role. At the time I was working for Cartoon Network and Adult Swim, in a great position, business strategy.
Mhm.
And I said, in my desire for my second one, I was like, I need to learn and grow. I can kind of do this stuff in my sleep. And so, because of my guiding principles, it was, you know what? I would learn a lot in this job. I can take on new ideas, and I have no idea what it will become, but let me just try it out.
Mhm.
I did it, loved it, built out a team, was traveling to San Francisco and New York and building out websites, working with Google and Apple. It was bomb. 6 months after we launched the business, one CEO left, a new CEO came in, and the last business started, which was ours, was the first business cut.
Right,
Now, many, many years later, they were clearly preparing to sell. Now it's AT&T and T and Warner Media, but this was before any of that was even a conversation.
right.
At the time I got laid off, or my entire business unit got cut, I was 8 months pregnant
Wow.
with my first and only child. And so, talking about how to hear no at a really bad time, like, hey, and HR was like, oh, well, we'd love to keep you. I'm a house. Like, who am I interviewing with? I'm not working for anyone at the moment.
Mhm.
And I said, you know what? Let me just go have my daughter and I'll figure out the rest. God has my back. I'm a woman of faith. And so I left, and literally, I think my last day was June 12th. I had my daughter May 31st.
Mhm.
And so I had her about 2 months later, went to the arena, then Phillips Arena, as a fan to go to an NBA draft party because I'm a basketball fan, and
Right.
went with a friend of mine and ran into one of my old mentors from Turner who had left Turner to come and be CEO of the Hawks. Didn't know he was going to be there. We didn't talk about it in advance. He sees me and is like, hey, I might need your help building a brand. Because he
Wow.
remembered me when I was a ball girl for the Hawks mopping up sweat. He
Mhm.
also remembered me working on brand strategy projects while at Turner, but I never worked for him, never reported to him, but reputation and all of that connected.
Right.
So I started sitting in on some meetings and helping. He said, why don't you consult? So I started consulting. And then maybe about 9 months later, I ended up coming on board with the Hawks as a vice president of brand strategy, which I would have never imagined the day I got laid off.
Mhm.
And then come to find out later on that when he left Turner, he had a no poaching policy in his contract where he couldn't take any talent with him from the company. So had I not taken that job that he probably told me not to take and not gotten laid off, I probably wouldn't even be in the opportunity or the position that I'm in right now with the Hawks.
Right.
So the idea of knowing that sometimes you're getting told no and that door is closing on purpose to help get you to something else, it's so hard to see in the moment.
Yeah.
But
I mean, that's something I struggle with all the time. I have so many different opportunities, and one of my mentors, he basically told me like, you are more attractive when you can say no. So saying yes to everything, jumping at everything is, it seems in the moment, it seems like the best thing to do. But when you know what you want out of life, and when you know what you don't want, so part of knowing what you want is knowing what you don't want. So,
mhm,
what I like about your principles is it tells you what you want and it talks about what you don't want, right? So you said you don't want to be a workaholic. So working somewhere that takes you away from time with your family and your daughter, that's just a no brainer. Like you're not, even if it's a good opportunity, you're like nope, right? But
yeah.
most people, if they don't have the principles, and me just being young in business, I'm considering it like, oh, okay, I will do this, I'll do that, and
But sometimes it takes you doing that to understand the principles. So like you asked the question of what experiences happened to get you there. Like I was in the position where if I didn't have it, I realized how important it was for my life. And
mhm,
so like those things you can't you have to kind of go through it sometimes. Other times you can see it. But the one thing I'll also say is I wouldn't focus on the negative, focus on what you do want. Because I also believe in looking at it in the positive and the affirmative will really help guide that, as opposed to like there'll be a million things you don't want, but what is important, and that's a critical distinction.
mhm. And I want to wrap up, and I want to talk about something you said in your book, that you still don't know what you want to be when you grow up, and that's a very open-minded statement, because ever since we can, think about school or a career path, somebody always put pressure on us as young adults and young children, asking you, what do you want to be when you grow up? What are you studying in school? What do you want to do? And for you to be as accomplished as you are and successful as you are, you don't have to do anything else, and your track record speaks for itself. But for you to say, I still don't know what I want to be, and I'm open to new opportunities, I think that's very impactful. So could you speak to that? Because I feel like that's going to help a lot of young people, particularly who follow, my movement and everything I do, is because people DM me. I get over 100 DMs a day, and half of them are, hey, how did you find your passion? How did you figure it out? And what I tell a lot of people is, I struggled and had a failing business before this. And one thing that it's so crazy how this book impacted me. So when you start talking about the pivot, that is the that is exactly what I did. So I had a company. Um, it was about financial literacy, because that's what I promote now: financial literacy, entrepreneurship,
Mhm.
leadership, things like that. But it was focusing primarily on like student loans, because I had to put myself through college. I had to take out student loans. So I was teaching and educating people about that, and just the nicest way to say it is, it failed. I didn't make any money. I lost money. Actually, I did my taxes, lost probably about $10,000, and I'm like, I'm not losing another $10,000. So I stopped that business. And the goal was still to educate my community on financial literacy. So that was like always my end goal. And one of the leadership books I read in college always talked about start with why, start with the end in
Yep,
mind. And
absolutely.
and I just kept thinking about that, like, okay, why am I doing this? I still want to educate. And then I'm like, okay, um, I met the guy who, and I don't know if you know this guy, but his name is Lonnie Johnson. He's he started the Super Soaker. He created the
Oh
Super Soaker.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I met him at the gathering spot, actually, and he started telling me about, his experience, and we talked for about 20 minutes. And I was like, and he was sitting in the stand, like it was at a event. He was sitting in there with me. I didn't know who he was. Everybody else walking around probably didn't know who he was. And I'm like, this guy's worth $500 million sitting next to you, and you're not even speaking to him. And then the idea of black millionaires, to promote people that we don't know who are successful, and black millionaires, executives, business owners, that idea came to me. And it was
Awesome.
it was very hard. I had to, all the branding, all the money, all everything I put towards one business, I had to pivot. and go to my next business. So it was still on financial literacy, educating the community, but my whole brand strategy and everything had to
Mm-hmm.
switch. And now people see what I'm doing now a year later, and they're like, wow, how long have you been doing this? And I'm like, well, if you're gonna count all
A
the years
long
I've been
time. You
struggling,
absolutely
if you're
counted
gonna
because
count
that's
all the
what
years I've
helped.
been struggling, I've been
Yeah.
doing it a long time. But you've
Yeah.
probably been following me for the last year, but I've been struggling, and I made a crucial pivot, just based off, just my experiences, starting with why, and
But
that's
that wasn't a struggle. That was the education. I mean, without that, you wouldn't get there. And I'm such a huge believer. People are like, what's your biggest failure? I was like, I didn't have any failures. I had learning opportunities. That's what I had. Because for everything that didn't fail, even the brand that I started that went that, I had the best learning opportunity through that ultimately got me to where I am today. So like, absolutely, that's part of your journey. And
Yeah,
that's
yes.
awesome.
I make sure I emphasize that and tell people that, because a lot of times a lot of small business owners or people who are early in their career and they're not prospering, again, that setting, I want to be this by 30, those goals, those linear goals, it get us caught up a lot, because we see other people posting up, and especially with social media now that everybody
Yeah,
has
that's tough.
something to promote or
Tough.
showing everything they did in the stock market or whatever, it makes you get FOMO of, you feel like you're missing out and you feel like a failure. But for me, I just had to look at myself and look at the experience that I had. And I just made a crucial pivot, and people were laughing at me like, here you go with another business, here you go with another idea. And now it's actually gaining some traction. And now people are like, I always remember. So it's people who wrote me and write me every day. And they say, I remember when you was making corny videos in college. So I used to be making videos and things like that in college, and people used to laugh at me. And those same people are now in my DMs asking me on advice. And I'm like, well, the advice I would give you to go back when you were laughing at me, that guy, that person, you need to be in that stage, figuring it out and be willing to put yourself out there and get laughed at. So now in a few years, you got all that experience, so you will be ready for opportunity. And that really impacted me, to for you to talk about that pivot and being able to change change your mindset and be open to new opportunities and realize when something's not working. That was really
Mhm.
crucial for me, because I was doing the stuff I'm doing now. I was doing similar things, but I just made a few different tweaks in my business model and in my strategy, and the rest is history. And now I'm still, I'm building out what I have now.
That's awesome. And congratulations to you because you're doing amazing work. And I think a lot of time it's positioning, it is
Yeah.
positioning and understanding your target and what's going to resonate versus what's not. So you got to try things till you figure it out. We do
Yeah.
it with the Hawks all the time. The one thing I'll say in closing to your question of, how do I continue to be open? There's a fear inside sometimes, especially if you don't know if you can do something. And so last year, one of my kind of mental thing was push myself outside my comfort zone, because a lot of times you can be in it and like you got it, it's easy, like even doing these kinds of conversations, I wasn't doing many of them before. And even writing my book, it was years and years like, oh my god, I'm gonna do it. I was like, you're gonna do it, like let's finish it. And so sometimes it's that personal drive, and everyone's personal drive is different, and I've learned that more probably from writing this book than anything else. I have family members who've known me my entire life who read this book and they're like, I didn't know half of this stuff about you. You've done so much. And, they're like, well, how are you motivated? Who's pushing you? And I'm like, I push me. God pushes me. Because for me, that whole idea of like just striving, many people don't have it.
Mhm.
And I learned early on in my career, there's some folks who need things in black and white. That is, tell me exactly what to do and I will do it. And that's it. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Mhm.
And there are other people who can take a blank sheet of paper and create something. And the
Mhm.
story that you just gave in that example is, you're just trying different things and creating different things. I'm like that as well. And I think that's the artist and the creative in me. That's a
Mhm.
very different skill set. None of them are good, bad, and different. They're just different. And
Right.
so the ability to go in an environment and try something new and push boundaries and test things and see what works and doesn't, and fall flat on your face and get up and try something else, it
Mhm.
takes a lot of effort and energy to do that. But
Mhm.
I also think it just makes what happens in the end so much sweeter.
Yeah, yeah. So I really appreciate you for coming on here and sharing your story and sharing your principles. If you guys want to learn more, you definitely want to check out From Ball Girl to CMO. Could you tell everyone where they can find the book and actually get access to it?
Absolutely. Well, it's on Amazon, so feel free to look there. Also, you can visit my website, melissamproctor.com,
Mhm.
or feel free to follow me on Instagram, IG at Melissa M. Proctor as well. And thank you so much for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you guys for tuning in to James Hill TV. I'll see you guys next week. All right. I really appreciate you for coming on here. And
Oh, man, for sure.
so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna buy 10 copies and I'll give them away to some
Oh,
of my
thank
team
you.
members. And I don't know if you have anybody in mind, we can give them away to as well. But I'll buy 10 copies and send them out because I think this book is really impactful. It impacted me, so I want to be able to
Well, I
spread it out.
appreciate the support.